Welcome to the GPE webinar series. My name is Maria Qureshi. I work on equity and inclusion at the Global Partnership for Education. I'm joining from my home near the GPE Secretariat in Washington, D.C., and we are also joined by a wonderful panel of experts who are also joining us online. So just a bit of background about the GPE webinars. GPE webinars, which started in 2016, are part of GPE's Knowledge and Innovation Exchange KICS initiative that came about as a response to GPE's partner countries' request for additional opportunities to exchange knowledge, good practice, and policy approaches that inform education policies and practices at the country level. The webinar also gives practitioners the opportunity to engage in a continuous practice of knowledge exchange between partner countries, which in turn strengthens and fulfills the national and global objectives of GPE. This particular webinar is the fifth in series, focusing on collecting and using data on marginalized groups for education. And previously, you have heard from our colleagues in the Girls Education Challenge, from UIS, and then a lot of other organizations, some in Pakistan, some who work in Africa. So the series is tackling issues such as how to identify disability and measure inclusive learning environments, the role of community and citizen-led initiatives, and the use and limitations of new technologies, and gathering better data. And our main aim is to convene key partners working on these issues and to foster collaborations that can hone and apply new ideas. So before we begin the session, I would just like to draw attention to a few housekeeping rules. If you are facing connection issues, please let us know via email at webinars@globalpartnership.org. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation, so feel free to keep sending your questions throughout the webinar through the YouTube's live chat feature or by email. And the email address would again be webinars@globalpartnership.org. So you can keep on sending your questions, but we'll be addressing them towards the end. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. Please do let us know your name, your organization, and the name of the presenter or speaker to whom the question is directed. So that will make it easier for us to direct your questions. This session is also being recorded, and we will send everyone participating today resources associated with the webinar and a link to the recorded session. So don't worry if you miss out something in the presentations that you really wanted to note. You'll get everything after a couple of days. We have live captions or subtitles in English for today's session, and you should be able to see the link to the page where we can watch the video with live captions underneath in the comments box on YouTube. If you're having difficulty accessing that, you can again, type in YouTube, and our team can send you the link for that. Today's session is about using evidence to count how many children are out of school and to develop policy to bring them back into education. We're going to reflect in particular on experiences from the Out of School Children Initiative, a partnership between UNICEF and UNESCO UIS, UNESCO Institute of Statistics, which was developed and launched in 2010, and which GPE also joined in 2014. We are also going to be looking at some of the methodological issues and pitfalls in counting out of school children using survey data. So our focus today on the need to monitor children who are out of school and develop policies to ensure they can learn is especially timely given the COVID-19 crisis. We know that at least 50 GPE countries have closed schools because of the pandemic, with many countries closing schools nationwide and a few closing them in selected areas. GPE is particularly concerned about the potentially serious impact on children missing out on learning and other vital services, and committed to supporting partner countries to cope with the impacts of the pandemic and keep its focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized group of children. Hence, it will be important to learn from past crises as to what has worked to keep children learning, and also to reflect on the challenge presented by the crisis and the large school closures that have followed for initiatives like the Out-of-School Children initiative. Now, let me just introduce you to our presenters and discussants today, and then we'll just hand over to them without any further delay. Mark Waltham joined UNICEF's Nepal country office as a chief of education last year, having previously worked as a senior education advisor in New York headquarters for 6 years, focusing on access and equity in education, including leading the Out-of-School Children initiative. Before joining UNICEF, Mark spent 13 years as a senior education advisor in the Department for International Development, including postings in a number of countries. In the past, Mark has also worked at Cambridge University and as a secondary school mathematics teacher in the UK and Ghana. Next, we have Wangani, who is a senior education advisor, gender equity and inclusion with UNICEF, where she promotes and supports access to equitable and inclusive education through global advocacy and strategic programming for gender responsive education systems, and also coordinates the Global Out-of-School Children initiative. Wangani has previously served as chief of education with UNICEF country offices in Iraq and Sierra Leone. Before joining UNICEF, she worked with Open Society Foundation, Action Aid, and Catholic Relief Services, to name a few. Sheena Bell is our next presenter, who is a PhD student in education leadership and policy at the University of Toronto's Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, with 10 years experience in education development with the United Nations. She's been a UNICEF regional education specialist for Europe and Central Asia, and assistant program specialist in the education indicators and data analysis section of the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. Her work focused on the UNICEF Global Initiative on Out-of-School Children, as well as issues related to out-of-school children data and household survey analysis is extensive. She co-authored the UNICEF report Fixing the Broken Promise of Education for All, findings from the Global Report on Out-of-School Children. Next, we have Bilal Barakat, who joined the GEM report team at the beginning of 2018 as a senior policy analyst. He is an academic researcher and consultant with a portfolio of expertise in various aspects of education, statistics, and policy, especially at the intersection of education and demography. Before coming to Paris, Bilal taught and researched these issues based primarily at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. In addition, he regularly acted as a consulting expert for International Development Organization. His research has been published in leading international journals and featured in major international reports. We're so happy to have this panel today with us, and we cannot wait to hear you. So I'll just ask Mark if you're ready, and if you can just start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can.
Cool. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to give a very brief presentation on the origins of the Out-of-School Children Initiative, which was always called OOSCI. And the origins of OOSCI go back to the the origins of OOSCI go back to the number of children who are out of school. So this is a graph of the total number of children in the world out of school between the years 1990 and 2020. We haven't got the figures for the last couple of years. And as everybody can see, the number of children out of school at primary level, this is only for primary level, was rising through the 90s, reached a peak in about 1997, and then it started to drop. And then around 2007, that fall in the number of children out of school stalled. And it's been pretty much constant at about 60 million ever since then. Ever since 2007, every year, there have been about 60 million children out of school at primary level. And OOSCI started a couple of years, just before that. If we had managed to continue with the reduction in the number of children out of school at the same level between 1997 and 2007, we would have actually got all children into primary school by now. The stall just completely stopped progress. And the big question is, why did it stall? Governments didn't start doing anything different. There was a global economic crisis in 2007 and 2008, but funding for education resumed after that. That's obviously not the reason. So the big question was, why has the number of children out of school remained pretty much constant at 60 million ever since 2007? In other words, for the last 12 or 13 years. And so OOSCI started in 2010 when we started to notice that the stall had taken place. So that's when it started, and in a sense why it started. Two other just quick observations on this graph is that the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in 2000, well, 2001 really, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which were launched in 2015, it's quite interesting to note that they didn't actually have any impact on the trajectory of the number of children out of school. So the number of children out of school was already coming down when the MDGs were launched, and the launch of the SDGs hasn't changed the numbers in any way at all so far. Right. So what did we do in terms of trying to find out why the children are out of school? So this goes back to the OOSCI approach. When OOSCI was launched, we decided that we wanted to know who are the children who are out of school and where are they? And this, as it's a data-driven initiative. So we wanted to know the data on those children. And we wanted to know the data because the next question we wanted to answer is, why are they out of school? So the big thing here is that if we find that girls are out of school, the reason that they are out of school is not they are a girl. They are girls. That is not a reason for being out of school. There must be a barrier. There must be something keeping them out of school. And then the last part of the OOSCI approach is therefore to reduce that barrier or to eliminate it if possible. So the last part of the question is, how can they be brought to school and stay there? So in a nutshell, that's the OOSCI approach. And I just want to give a very quick illustration of why we adopted that approach. If you look at, this is data from Vietnam, it's out of school children, primary school age. Vietnam's done very well in terms of getting children into school. And there are 4% of children who are out of school back in 2009. These are quite old figures. There were 4% of children out of school. If you look at the gender breakdown, boys and girls, 4% of boys, 4%. There are slightly more children out of school in rural areas. That's probably expected. And then, of course, you can, if you've got the data, you can start looking at the different ethnicities in the country. So if you're a kin, then you are slightly less likely to be out of school. In other words, more likely to be in school than the average. Tays, even better. Thais, a little bit worse. Hmong, I guess, is a little bit better. But Khmers are quite significantly more likely to be out of school than other groups. And almost a quarter of the Hmong group are out of school. And then other groups about 10%. And that's quite interesting because what it shows is that it's not necessarily you know, boys or girls or urban or rural. It's particular groups of children, and it may be where they live, particular areas that they live. I'm told, I've never worked in Vietnam, but I'm told that the Hmong live in sort of hills in quite remote areas. And then, of course, you've got non-migrants and migrants you can look at if you've got the data for it, which you usually can't get from education management information systems. And then most interesting of all, in Vietnam, 4% of children who do not have disabilities are out of school. But a very significant proportion of the children, almost 90% of children with disabilities are out of school. And what this sort of, if you've got the data like this, it allows you to focus your attention on which children are out of school and which particular barriers they that you need to overcome to enable them to go to school. So, okay, moving on if I can. I'm sorry, my computer is very slow. There we go. Okay. So when we do an OOSCI study, we look at the EMIS, the Education Management Information System, but we also look at household surveys. And the reason we look at household surveys is you get far more data from them. You can identify particular groups of children more accurately. Children who are out of school, and also, as I think Sheena is going to be explaining, children who are at particular risk of dropping out of school. And from most of these studies, of course, none of this is going to come as a surprise to anybody, but the most likely to be out of school are, first and foremost, children from the poorest families. Children from the poorest quintile of families are most likely to be out of school. Children affected by conflicts or natural girls still, even though gender equity globally has been achieved, it hides huge disparities within countries and between countries. And in many places, even though there are equal numbers of girls and boys, girls do not have an equal opportunity to learn. Children with disabilities, one of the biggest groups out of school now. Children in remote areas, like the Hmong from Vietnam. Working children, and children from minority ethnic or language groups. And just to show you the way that OOSCI was supposed to work, is that we wanted to move on those 3 points, from profiles to barriers to responses. So profiles to the barrier, to identify the barrier, and then to identify a policy or a programming response. So if you identify that poor children are out of school, you need to go to the academic literature or the studies or something in the country and say, well, why are poor children out of school? It may be for a number of reasons. It may be because of direct costs or hidden costs. Maybe because poor children come from a particular group, and it may be discrimination or bias. Maybe that poor children tend to live in remoter areas, so it may be distance to school. And of course, whatever the reason is, you need to know the reason, because the responses will be different to each of the barriers. So if it's direct or hidden costs, free education. That's actually the biggest one usually. Discrimination or bias, you can use campaigns, change the law. Distance to school, you might want to put in place small schools with multi-level teaching, multi-grade teaching. And the idea of OOSCI was that you would work through all of the profiles. So girls, these are only illustrative, by the way. I'm not trying to explain every barrier or cover every barrier or response. So girls, there are all sorts of demand side and supply side barriers. So there are cultural norms, concerns about security, toilets are a big issue, particularly with adolescent girls. And interestingly, lack of role models also in many countries is lack of female teachers as role models is a huge barrier to girls going to or continuing in school. And again, you've got a range of campaigns on the supply side, on the demand side, and also often outside the education sector itself, or what you would consider to be the education sector. And finally, on this presentation, children with disabilities, which is probably around a third of all children out of school at the moment today, are children with disabilities. And they are out of school for probably the widest range of reasons. There are rules and norms. Schools often don't accept children with disabilities. Communities don't want to send them to school. Classrooms are inaccessible. There are no assistive devices for any of the children. And teachers don't know how to handle a child with a disability in their classes. And of course, there are obvious responses, but very difficult responses to put in place to all of these problems. And they all have to be put in place at the same time. And that's a snapshot of how OOSCI was supposed to work. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I'll just request Wangyani to add her comments. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you see the slides?
Not as of now.
Okay. Is it coming up now?
Yes, yes, we can see the slides now.
Great. Okay, thank you, Mark, for setting the background for the OOSCI. I'll just take it from where you stopped. Just departing from the point that since OOSCI was started, there has been some significant achievements that have been made. But at the same time, we also know that there's been some gaps and some challenges. And informed by those perspectives, there was an evaluation that was done in 2018 to just look at how the OOSCI was performing and if it was actually meeting the objectives for which it was set. There were key recommendations coming up from that particular study. One was to, of course, update the theory of change for the whole initiative, given that there had been some significant changes, of course, the adoption of the SDGs, as well as the whole concept of how the definition of out-of-school children has changed over the years. And secondly, was also to move from what is seen to have been one of the big achievements by the initiative, which is generation of data and evidence, but moving beyond that to focus more on policy, as well as implementation of education plans, but also the question of monitoring to look at the effectiveness of the whole initiative. At the same time, a key recommendation was also just to look at reorienting the methodology to include upper secondary school. Before that, the methodology of the OOSCI was not actually including children at upper secondary school level of education. An additional recommendation talked about looking at broadening the partnership, of course, for new ideas in terms of the initiative, but also to tap on resources of the new partners, both financially, but also technically, with a view to ensure that the whole initiative can be sustained going forward. One last key recommendation related to the whole question of how can we use the OOSCI to strengthen the programmatic elements to achieve the results that the OOSCI was set for. So as we are moving forward with the concept, we are actually looking at some key strategic shifts in terms of how the initiative is going to move forward. We are at the process of putting those into action at the moment. One key recommendation, as I mentioned previously, is the whole question of how do we move to data, from data and evidence generation to the actual policy initiatives, informing the plans, but also implementation of programs to get out-of-school children into school, but also monitoring the effectiveness of the whole initiative. So what we are looking at the moment is how do we translate the key and rich data that we have generated so far into something that results into reducing the number of out-of-school children. As you have seen from Mark's presentation, there's been a stagnation in terms of reducing the number of out-of-school children. But also, how do we link the data and evidence that we are generating to whole questions of costing, budget, as well as financial allocation? The policy recommendations coming from the studies, yes, were there, but without a very strong link to the whole question of costing, budgets, and financial allocation. But also a stronger emphasis on linking the data and evidence to other processes such as sector analysis, but also sector planning that are also supported by other partners. And also the whole question of using the OOSCI data that is generated not as a once-off study, but also looking at it as an ongoing process to continuously inform policies, implementation, but also evaluation of policies. The second shift we are looking at is, as I stated earlier, moving beyond the current OOSCI framework to including upper secondary school. So this is looking at the profiles of children aged 15 plus who are supposed to be at the level of upper secondary school, but also we are also quite challenged in this perspective because we are being informed by the Right to Education framework and the Decade of Action, which calls for 12 years of basic education. But we also know that in different contexts, in some countries, children or young people are able to join the labor market even after they have completed lower secondary school. So we have to look at all those nuances and see how we align such discrepancies to the whole framework of achieving 12 years of basic education. But also the whole concept of non-formal education. At the moment, the calculation of out-of-school children rates doesn't necessarily include children who are enrolled in non-formal education, but how do we make the linkages? Third, we are also looking at, currently there's a whole discussion and debates around the learning crisis. The World Bank did a study around, a report around the learning poverty, and continuously we're asking ourselves, how do we link such analysis to the question of out-of-school children, being that children not learning could be actually be the sum of those that are in school and not learning, as well as children who are actually not accessing education. So beyond access, how do we link the whole question of children not being in school and the whole question of children not learning? But at the same time, also looking at if learning is not effective in school, does this impact on the question of out-of-school children as more children drop out of school because they're not learning as effectively? But also continuously using the initiative and this data that we generate from out-of-school studies to monitor the effectiveness of policies, not just on access, but more increasingly on learning. Number 4, we're looking at the flexibility of approaches as well as the tools that we are actually using. What we have currently is an operational manual that guides countries to conduct out-of-school studies and how to engage partners. But we are increasingly seeing that there's need to link various resources from other partners to strengthen the evidence for out-of-school children, but at the same time to also link, as I indicated earlier on, with other sector analysis processes and sector planning. So beyond just having the operational manual, what we are looking at is expanding the conceptual framework of out-of-school children, but at the same time collecting a set of tools and resources that countries can use, whether as a whole, but also selectively, so that they can have maybe more informed deep dives informed by the context, and if also they want to look at a particular sector or look at the whole question of out of school altogether, but just really pulling together a whole sort of flexible resources and tools that countries can actually look at. Lastly, we are looking at broadening the partnership as we broaden out of school OOSCI to include upper secondary school. We know there are partners that we can actually tap into the initiative, of course, building on their technical strengths, but also looking at how we can harmonize approaches but also just strengthen the sustainability and also make sure that there's active partnership of other non-traditional partners in the whole initiative. So these are some of the key areas we are actually looking at in terms of moving forward with the OOSCI, and we are in the process of working on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Wangyani. We'll move on to the next presentation. So Bilal, if I can request you to please start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to present as part of this panel, even though this research is not part of OOSCI as such. And I would also like to, I should also say that this is research, the presentation is based on research I did in my own personal capacity before joining the GEM report. So there's no institutional mandate here, and all the blame is mine, so to say. Now, I want to focus on a question that comes even before the three very important questions that were mentioned before, namely, sometimes we have trouble even deciding whether children are out of school or not. And I don't mean the issue of deciding whether if someone hasn't been to school in 2 weeks, whether they are a dropout or a truant, but I mean the question of whether they're supposed to be in school in the first place. School age is the prime factor there. But the problem is that in many surveys to this day, it's changed for mix, fortunately, but many national surveys and many older surveys ask the age of the child at the last birthday. So you know that this child is 6 years old on the day of the interview. But you don't know exactly when they turned 6. All you know is they're 6 now, or 7 or 8, or whatever. Now, if the survey occurred, so let's say halfway through the school year, then the problem is that some of these kids who are 6 years now in the data, they were not actually 6 years old at the beginning of the school year. So maybe they weren't supposed to start school. So showing this graphically, any individual person moves along the diagonals in this graph, where you have the school year time on the x-axis and age on the y-axis. This is what demographers call a Lexis surface. Right? So everyone moves along the diagonals because as 1 month passes, you are 1 month older. If 1 year passes, you're 1 year older. So the true school entry cohort, that's represented by the parallelograms here, because those who were, say, at 6 or over, this is not for grade 1, but say for a 4-year primary cycle. Those between the ages of 6 and 10 at the beginning of the school year, by the end of the school year, obviously, they've aged 1 year. Right? But now, if you take a survey, if you take data, we only have the integer ages, and you apply the nominal, you say, well, school age for primary is defined to be 6 to 10. You end up looking at this rectangle here instead of the parallelogram. So what you end up with, the later in the school year the survey is, the more children you're including as being of school age, who only moved into this age group during the school year, and the more you're excluding, you think they're already too old for primary school, even though they were of the right age, it's just that they've had their birthday since. Now, when that measurement issue is not addressed, then all sorts of education indicators are potentially distorted. Obviously, this affects net enrollment, net attendance indicators, but also out of school numbers and rates of particular interest today. Clearly, it affects measures of overage enrollment and underage enrollment, but it also affects estimates of what is causing these indicators to be higher or lower. Now, given how clear the problem is, i.e. that some children have had their birthday since the beginning of the school year, it's surprising how incompletely that's actually dealt with. So you see a lot in the literature that the effect is acknowledged, but it'll say that it's likely to be minor, or maybe this will change the number by a few percentage points. But that's not actually true. So the effect could easily be 20 percentage points if you have a 5-year primary cycle and the survey is at the very, very end of the school year, for example. You could entirely be off base estimating overage enrollment. Another issue is that there's very little operational advice on what you can actually do about this that goes beyond saying, well, just be aware of it when you interpret the numbers. And some of the solutions out there don't actually solve the problem. So one approach that's widely used is to say, well, if the surveys conducted in the first half of the school year, you do nothing. And if it's conducted in the second half of the school year, then you change everyone's age by a whole year, you shift it down. There are various issues with that, but one of them is that often fieldwork stretches over months. And it's not random. So enumerators might move from region to region. So you have some regions where the interviews were conducted before the midpoint of the school year, and another region where it was after. So you're going to be adjusting one, but not the other, creating issues there. Now, I don't want to point fingers at all, but this example is so visually striking that it's really tempting. It's too tempting to leave out. And I want to present it more in the spirit of that this happens to the best of us, really. So there's this study of non-attendance by age, with single years of age, comparing 2 different surveys 5 years apart. And the authors in this report, there's speculation on why did attendance go down at some ages, but went up at other ages, trying to come up with an explanation of that. But as a matter of fact, these surveys were not conducted at the same point in the school year. So really, if you just shift the age axis appropriately, then the whole question disappears into thin air. What's interesting here is that actually the parents, when asked why their child was not attending school, 3/4 of the nominally 6-year-olds, of those who were 6 years old at the time of survey, the parents said they weren't old enough. But even parents explicitly saying they were not old enough just gave rise to speculation in the report for why they would say that, rather than just accepting that that's because they were in fact not 6 years at the beginning of the school year. So what this research I did on this issue showed was that the error can be really substantial, not just theoretically, but in real world applications, but that there is actually something we can do about it on the existing data, where you just have the age and whole years. That is a lot better than just shifting everyone by a whole year or not. The idea is that, suppose in the middle of the school year, we observe some 6-year-olds at that time, and I'm assuming an entry age of 6 here for this example, that half of those, if birthdays are occur at random during the year, then half of those were actually only 5. So one way to resolve the issue would be to actually just calculate the indicator with ignoring the youngest and the oldest age group. So if primary school age is 6 to 10, then you could just calculate the indicator on 7 to 9 to be more robust. But if we actually want to stick with the whole age range, then the question becomes, how do we decide which children we think were actually 6 at the beginning of the school year and which do we think were actually 5? And how do we relate that to their enrollment status now? And I'm trying to illustrate here that there are different assumptions you could make. Right? One would be that attendance actually doesn't correlate at all with true age. Right? So that's the bottom assumption here. So whether someone is found in the data to be attending or not has no bearing on whether you assign a probability of them having been of school age already at the beginning of the school year. A totally different assumption is to say, okay, all of those attending, we assume they're the older ones. So first, we assume that all those attending were in fact already of school age. And then any that are left over, we fill up with the presumed 5-year-olds. And another solution, another attempt, is to take advantage of the fact that fieldwork often spreads several months. So in different locations, in different households, different amounts of the school year have already passed. So what you would expect to see is that if you look at nominally 6-year-olds, in households that were interviewed earlier in the school year, more of them will in fact have been 6 at the beginning of the school year. So you'll see higher attendance. And the later in the school year a household was interviewed, the more likely the 6-year-olds you find there were actually only 5 at the start of the school year. So you can try and do a regression on the actual interview date, on the proportion of the school year that has elapsed. And what I did here is an analysis on data where you had exact ages. So these dots here are the actual true values at the very beginning and the very end of the school year for true 6-year-olds at that time. And one can see that as a proof of concept, at least, doing this regression on the date of interview is actually a plausible approach to try and estimate how many 6-year-olds at the beginning of the school year were attending, rather than the 6-year-olds you happen to observe at some random time. Now, an example, an application here, again, not to point fingers, but this is a finding that unfortunately grew legs and was cited inappropriately, I find, to make an argument that official register-based education data can't be trusted and that we should just stop paying attention to it, basically. Unfortunately, that was actually based on a statistical artifact. So what we have here is a graph from this report that compared the net primary enrollment rate according to official MOE data and compared that to survey-based estimates. And the survey-based estimates appear to show that there's basically no positive trend, and that things are not improving, and that this increase in the official data is at worst fraudulent and at best sort of distorted or misleading. But again, it's actually the case that these two waves of these surveys were conducted at different times in the school year. And when you take that into account and you produce these estimates of the actual enrollment or net attendance rate, correcting for the age effect, then one sees that whatever method one uses, one does actually find a positive trend. Now, as I already said, the recent mix waves in particular actually do capture exact ages, which allows one to calculate properly for each child how old they were in fact at the beginning of the school year. Unfortunately, that doesn't fully solve the problem. First of all, there are still plenty of surveys around, and there are still surveys being conducted that don't capture exact ages. But even if we look at mix, if we try to calculate trends from older surveys back in time that didn't have exact age, and we compare them now to estimates based on exact age, then we still have a distortion in the trend. There have also been attempts to use in DHS the fact that you have exact birthdays for the biological children of the household head. But in that, again, introduces a bias because the non-biological children are likely to have different education outcomes. Another complication, unfortunately, especially looking at the transition into the entry into primary school, is how we treat pre-primary, or this question of how we should be treating pre-primary. What's happening now is that both for the SDG indicator looking at pre-primary attendance, you are counted even if you're already in primary school proper, but also now, since last year, for the primary attendance rate and primary out-of-school rate, you're counted as in school if you are attending pre-primary. But now, if you look at the example of Nigeria here, for example, then you see that 1 year before primary entry age, you have a large majority attending some kind of education. And at entry age also, you have an even larger majority attending some kind of formal education. But at the same time, the share of children who actually follow what is supposed to be the standard trajectory, who at this age are in primary, and then at this age are in pre-primary, excuse me, and then enter primary on time. So the share of children who enter primary on time, having had pre-primary experience, that's actually only 12%. So we are missing the fact that only a small minority of children are actually going through what is supposed to be the standard trajectory if we conflate pre-primary and primary attendance in this way. So to wrap up, what we are thinking in terms of how we're thinking about out-of-school measures traditionally is as a snapshot head count. How many children are out of school? By thinking a bit harder about this issue of exact age and who exactly is of school age and who isn't of school age, that suggests a slightly different perspective. It suggests thinking about over the life course, how many child years are spent out of school. So it suggests that we think about out of school childhood, right, as an experience, how much time you spend out of school on average, rather than as a head count. And I'm going to leave you with that thought. This was a bit more technical than the previous presentations. If you want to know about the details, here are the references. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bilal.
I'm trying to close it now.
That's fine. Thank you, and thank you for sharing the resources in your PowerPoint, because we got a lot of requests saying that they would like to see the paper and the resources that you did. This is really helpful. So if you could please.
Of Toronto and formerly UN staff member in education with UIS and UNICEF. And I want to turn today to talk about some of the lessons learned out of the initiative that I think we can apply to the current out-of-school children crisis. So as of yesterday, there was 1.7 billion children globally who are out of school. And there were a lot of really interesting resources and thinking that was done through the Out-of-School Children Initiative that I'd like to share today that can apply to the current COVID-19 school closure crisis. Just there we go. Okay. So I want to talk in two parts. The first part, briefly about the international level and how the partnership between UIS and UNICEF actually influenced the international measurement of out-of-school children and children at risk of dropping out. But then I want to turn in the bulk of the presentation to the national level, because while international measures of out-of-school children helps donors and helps us monitor global targets and progress towards them, where the rubber really hits the road and where we can actually reach out-of-school children and children at risk of dropping out is through the improvement of national and school level data systems and response. So I'm going to talk about some follow-on resources and studies and frameworks that were developed out of the Out-of-School Children Initiative and can be used to improve both data systems, policies, and practices related to identifying and supporting out-of-school children and children at risk of dropping out. And I want to make the point that while now we're talking about the importance of finding learning platforms and ways to deliver learning services to children, we should also be thinking about our data systems and whether our national data systems, our administrative data systems, schools themselves and their registries are fit for purpose to be able to identify who is out of school, who is chronically absent, and how we can, in this current context, find those children and support them in an appropriate way in the era of physical distancing. So without further ado, I'll step into the international side. So the Out-of-School Children Initiative is framed around a conceptual framework around 5 dimensions, which are 5 groups of children, which were particularly important that every study had to look at. And the dimension 2 and 3 in blue are the out-of-school children of primary and lower secondary age. And these were the kind of classic groups that in the era of the Millennium Development Goals that we focused on. But in working with UNICEF and while I was at UIS, there was a lot of encouragement from UNICEF to think about other groups that we needed to really capture quantitatively and in numbers to be able to tell the full picture in the out-of-school children studies. And that's what actually Bilal was just talking about, the idea of those of pre-primary age who are not in school, and those who are in school but at risk of dropping out, because of course it's easier to support a child who's at risk of dropping out and help them stay in school than to try to find children once they've already dropped out. But what's really interesting from the sort of data perspective is that at the UIS level, there was only established indicator methodology for dimension 2 and 3, but there wasn't actually any established methodology and indicators for measuring the pre-primary age out of school or the concept of risk of dropping out. And so these actually had to be developed at the international level to be able to guide the studies and the frameworks that were developed for the Out-of-School Children Initiative. And so it was a very interesting and fruitful collaboration between UIS and UNICEF to do that. And as you've seen, so this idea of this first dimension, these children of pre-primary age who are out of school, in fact, we at UIS created an indicator to be able to measure that for the study and programmed it at the international level. And that indicator became the exact indicator which is used for the global SDG indicator 4.2.2. So there's actually, I think, a quite direct link between indicators that were created for the Out-of-School Children Initiative and what we monitor globally now at the international level. The other challenge presented to UIS as part of the Out-of-School Children Initiative was the idea of how do we measure risk of dropout. Of course, it's a relative term. And of course, there is no one way to measure it in the sense that there are risk factors that vary between groups and within countries. The share of children at risk of dropping out can be very different because the dropout rates are very different across countries. So in the end, through collaboration with regional and national experts who are facing that same challenge in their own studies, we came up with in the operational manual methodology around direct measures of dropout, so those who realize their risk of dropout, and indirect measures of dropout, where we could kind of estimate a potential student population and a share that might be more at risk of dropping out. And this is linked, for example, to being 2 or more years over age. So being over age, a combination of perhaps late entrance to primary education, dropout and re-enrollment, or repetition. And so you can see how important proper age data is, especially linking back to Bilal's presentation, when you want to measure the share of children at risk of dropping out if your age data is not accurate. And of course, we thought also that one major risk factor is not learning. So the indicators around not meeting minimum learning standards could also help us estimate a share of the population who is at risk of dropping out because they're basically silently excluded in the classroom. The findings of the first wave of out-of-school children studies were published in a global report in 2015, and that was at the shift between the Millennium Development Goals towards the Sustainable Development Goals, where the global agenda was shifting from out-of-school children to learning and to a very much broader sense of what we needed to achieve as a globe in terms of education. And so the narrative of this study was to say, hey, there are still out-of-school children that we need to worry about. And here are these particular profiles. Here are some barriers that they face that came out of the studies that we did in these 26 countries in the first wave. And how can we move forward to make sure that these children are not left behind? And shockingly and ironically, today, with 1.7 billion children out of school, the issue of out-of-school children has now become the top of the agenda. And so this study may be interesting and has become shockingly relevant again. So I want to move now from the international level to the national level, because if we think about how out-of-school children are measured at the international level, it's measured as a residual. So you take the estimated population of school-age children in a country, and then you subtract the number of children who are enrolled in school of that age, and the number that remains is the number of out-of-school children. But of course, this is an indirect measure of out-of-school children. And if you actually want to identify and reach those children who are out of school and at risk of dropping out, it's all about national data systems, and it's all about what data the school and different actors at the ground level have. And so I want to talk about some resources now which are coming in just after and as a result of the Out-of-School Children Initiative. And the idea that this comes out of is that at the Out-of-School Children Initiative, and when we were thinking of the methodology, the idea of the policy, the data part, we thought that would be the easiest. We take existing surveys, existing EMIS data, we'd create tables, we'd identify profiles, and then we move very quickly to why are those kids out of school and what can we do about it? But even in countries like Europe and Central Asia, which should have more institutionalized data systems, there were so many challenges in coming up with accurate and disaggregated figures on these different dimensions of exclusion on these different types of children. And you would be surprised how many countries lack a consistent and comprehensive definition of dropout, counting in how many days or hours a child should be out of school, for what reasons, and what are the protocols to respond to that child when that child reaches that threshold. There are so many gaps at the national level, which created a lot of problems when we were doing the study. And so in the Europe and Central Asia region of UNICEF, they started to do a deeper investigation into national administrative data systems. It did a lot of diagnostics of where these data on out-of-school children were finding challenges. And so the publication that was produced is called Monitoring Education Participation, and it's a framework that looks at administrative data systems for education from the perspective of out-of-school children and children at risk of dropping out, which is clearly a very important topic today. So I'm going to walk through some of the key concepts about how this can be useful in the current context, thinking about how our data systems are fit for purpose to identify out-of-school children as a cause of the COVID-19 school closures. One of the key models is around visibility. And when we say visibility, we mean, are out-of-school children and data and information about them known to the Ministry of Education? So who are the children that the Ministry of Education school knows about? And we call these the visible out-of-school children. And these are typically children who are registered in the school records and the school registry as having been dropped out. So there is some information at the fingertips of the Ministry of Education, and they know about those children. But there are also children who have never been to school, so are not in any school records, but have interacted with other government services, government agencies. For example, they're registered in the civil registry, they've had vaccinations and are on the different records. And so we call these the semi-invisible out-of-school children, the children who could be identified if information was shared between different government actors, whether at the local level through paper-based sharing or at the national level through interlinked databases. The last group of children are invisible out-of-school children, children who are not in any government database. These are undocumented children, children living on the street, where there's no data or information at all. And these are the hardest children to find and reach, both in terms of data and response. So the framework outlines 8 steps to really look through the data system from the level of definitions, data cleaning, and kind of collection of accurate data towards the second stage, which is the more full and complete sharing of information from school to Ministry of Education and across sectors. So between service providers, both at the national and school level. And the last of the 8 steps in this framework looks at how you take that data and actually make it useful for the different kinds of users that you have, whether parents in schools or policymakers at the national level. So these are the 8 steps, and I want to show this to you because I think that this framework is a really useful framework to think about our current national data systems, to be able to understand how we need to retool them for the current out-of-school children crisis. So this includes how do we define out-of-school children in the current crisis, and how do we improve information sharing between school and national level and across services. And there's a very interesting section on best practices around use of that data, whether that's using data at the school level to develop an early warning system for dropout, but also how to use data visualization and other tools to create an EMIS that can generate automatic reports that creates data and information interpretation that's useful for schools and teachers and different actors in the system. So that's the first publication and the first resource I wanted to share about the data system and how to get that information on all of these different types of out-of-school children and children at risk of dropping out. But in the region of Europe and Central Asia, we asked a second question, which is, okay, that's great, and identifying those children is super important, and it's the first step. But what do we do once we have identified them? What policies at the national level, what practices at the school and community level can we have to be able to get those kids back into school and keep them in there learning and happy once they're there? So the second companion publication is the Improving Education Participation framework, and the brilliant author is online right now, which I'm very happy about, Laetitia Antonovitz. So this is the 10 areas of policy and practice development that is discussed in improving education participation. And I want to point to, in particular, some of the key areas which I think are really important in the current context of the COVID-19 school closures. And that's really around timely enrollment in school and supporting school transitions. So what I am really afraid of in the current crisis, that with the disruption of schooling routines, social routines, with kind of physical routines, that there were so many children who were just holding on in the system, whose schools were working with, communities were working with to keep them engaged. And with this disruption, they may never come back to school. So this publication presents information from the literature on each of these areas of policy and practice development, but actually features a lot of examples of real programs and real policies that align to these different areas and explain on how they worked, what kinds of children that they targeted, and provides more information on where you can find out about these different policies and practices. So I really encourage you to take a look at this publication, and all links will be shared at the end of the discussion. So one of the other components of improving education participation, this second publication on the response to children out of school and at risk of dropping out, is a self-assessment tool. And I just want to flag this because it's a way for you to think through your national system, your national response, local response to children who are out of school and at risk of dropping out, and to think through what might be some of the gaps, what might be some of the priorities you want to make, and that these all link to the areas that are discussed in the publication. So it might be a good place to start to think through your own system and how it might need to be retooled in the current era of 1.7 billion children out of school. The last publication that I want to talk about is coming out of both the work on data in the region of Europe and Central Asia and the work on the response to out-of-school children and children at risk of dropping out. And that's school-based programs on early warning systems for dropout. So how can schools and local level be able to identify children who are at risk and support them? So this publication explains how somebody could, and a team could develop an early warning system for dropout. So by using data and selecting indicators on how we might identify those children at risk of dropping out, how we might understand the reasons why. So in step 3, those children are facing risk and may drop out, and how we might actually respond to those children and what implementation measures. And I want to make the point that this early warning system doesn't require a very sophisticated national data system. So we don't need some sort of red flag electronic record system at the national level. It can in fact be done without a very strong and electronic EMIS system at the national level, and can be run at the school or local level, and can be run, for example, through the current crisis, considering how schools are reaching out to the children that were formerly enrolled in person in their classrooms. And I just want to make the last point that the work, although originating in Europe and Central Asia, the monitoring framework on data systems is not just applying to systems which have a sort of history of being rather institutionalized. The publication was co-published by UIS and UNICEF, and has been recently applied in South Asia and other parts of the world. And it applies to data systems at all different levels of sophistication. So if your data system is based on paper and aggregate numbers, there's still a lot of really important recommendations and considerations that this publication can do to help you think through your system. So I want to finish here by thinking now about how we can respond to the current out-of-school children crisis, bringing on the lessons of the Out-of-School Children Initiative. And so I really believe that there is a high risk of dropout due to the school closures. As I mentioned, the disruption of so many aspects of children's lives, particularly children who were already vulnerable and at high risk of dropping out. And I'm concerned that with that disruption, it will echo the risk that we've seen in our studies on out-of-school children, that many children drop out in the transitions between levels, or when there's some sort of discontinuity in their studies. And so I want to ask 3 questions. The first one is, how will our administrative data systems, our national EMIS systems, develop new definitions of what it means to be in school and out of school, what it means to be chronically absent, if we're moving to an online platform, if we're moving to a TV or radio platform, or a sort of parent-led education platform. So in the short term, how are our data systems able to understand and capture these children? Second, on the response side, how will physical distancing and the closure of services, whether government services like social work, whether school meals provision, whether sports and other community-based activities, affect this wraparound support that was formerly being given to children who are at risk of dropping out? So how are our national systems going to be able to compensate for that, for those services that were helping that child, not just from the educational perspective, but comprehensively? And the last and third question I want to leave with you is that when schools open again, and they will, how and to what extent are our national data systems able to identify, count, and monitor the children who don't come back? Are our data systems ready to do that? And I think the time is now to think through that, so that when those schools reopen, there is information on who and what, who is out of school, where they live, and how we can reach them, because that was really the most important aspect of the Out-of-School Children Initiative, and I think more than relevant today. And so I hope that the resources I shared today are a step towards answering those questions, and I'd be happy to answer any more questions during the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheena, and thank you for providing us, a very smooth transition to the Q&A by asking a few questions. I would just ask initial responses to Sheena's question, and then we can move on to the questions that were asked by the audience on our YouTube channel. So if anyone has any initial responses or thoughts to Sheena's questions or thought starters, that would be really great.
Maria, if I could come in, can you hear me? Yes, so
Yes,
I'm just
yes, I can.
taking the example of Sierra Leone, where I was at the time of Ebola, and we also had schools closed across the country. And as we were thinking of school reopening and all the back to school campaigns, one of the key questions we kept asking ourselves was, how are we going to monitor if all children are going to go back into school? And we did work collaboratively with the Ministry of Education, but also used some innovative data collection mechanisms using real-time data through an SMS app, which monitors used to go to each and every school. And at that time, they were able to reach between 90 to 98% of the schools. Of course, data accuracy is something that was so questionable, but there were simple questions like 5 to 10 questions that were just asking simple questions like, has the school opened, like in the first week of when the schools were opening? Are the teachers in school, like percentage of the teachers that have reported for schooling on that particular day, percentage of the learners that have actually reported for school on that particular day, and some of the systems we had put in place to prevent further spread of Ebola, like does the school have hand washing, soap, thermometers to measure, and are those measures being taken into account? So this was really useful in terms of giving us a picture of what was happening post the Ebola crisis, and also just to collect some preliminary data in terms of children returning back to school. There were, of course, questions of accuracy, but it did give us an idea in terms of the numbers that had actually returned, as well as the teachers and effectiveness of the whole social mobilization campaign to get the schools restarting. So I'm just giving this as one of the simple real-time data mechanisms that actually can be adopted to just get some preliminary pictures whilst you collect the more comprehensive data. Thank you.
Thank you. This is really great, and it ties in with one of the questions that we have been asked. So we have been asked a lot of questions regarding the present, COVID-19 crisis, and it's great that you, commented on how, you were able to cope with some of the challenges during the Ebola crisis. So there's a question that I wanted to, I think ask, which is more like a follow-up question to our other presenters as well, and you are also free to jump in. If there are any evidence-informed examples on policies and programs for re-entry following COVID-19 isolation, quarantine, and mitigation from, SARS, Ebola, conflict situations, or natural disasters that are relevant for this crisis. So you talked about, the SMS program example, but if any of our other presenters, came across something which might be useful for us, I will be happy to learn about that. Thank you. Mark or Bilal or Sheena, do you have any thoughts, or should we move to another?
Well, I mean, I see all of us basically scratching our heads and beards over this question. So maybe I'll jump the gun and give a reason for why I'm finding that difficult to answer, or one of the reasons I'm finding that difficult to answer now is that even though so part of it is that at some level it's too early, because we don't know what the re-entry situation will be, whether at that point we are talking about re-entry after having been away after closure of 4 months, or whether we're talking about re-entry after a closure of 10 months. At this point, we don't know what re-entry situation we're actually talking about. So that's one thing that makes it difficult from my point of view to answer now, although it does feel like we should already be thinking about it now, and we should be trying to put measures in place that we can build on when the time comes. But what exactly those are, maybe someone else wants to jump in.
Oh, thank you. This is great.
Sheena, go ahead, Mark.
Okay. I work in Nepal, and as of today, we have 0 children who are out of school because of COVID-19. And the reason for that is that schools are actually on holiday. It's the end of the school year. Schools are meant to open in the middle of April, in about 2 weeks' time. And of course they won't. So we will suddenly go from having 0 children out of school to having 7.4 million children out of school, because no schools are going to open in the country. We're all on lockdown. And Nepal, as everybody knows, suffered from a major earthquake in 2015, which we are just recovering from. And one of the interesting things is that getting children to go back to school after the earthquake was a really important feature of the recovery, and not just in terms of getting kids learning again and all the rest, but also giving children a sense of normality, and bringing them back into a sort of a routine and a rhythm and sort of daily life that they were used to, because the earthquake was a really sort of major event in everybody's lives in Nepal. But it was carried out largely at the local level. So it was teachers and local officials who went round and campaigned and knocked on doors and got people to send their children back to schools, or to find out where the children were so that they could be brought back to school. And in many cases, I think with COVID-19, I think a lot of it's going to be a local level initiative. It's going to be, the governments, governments or federal governments or local governments are going to open up countries again at some point. But then whether families send their kids back to school is going to be a much more local level decision, which I think is going to be carried out within communities or within much smaller groups.
Just to add briefly to what Bilal and Mark have shared, I agree that there are examples of natural and emergencies, where natural disasters and emergencies where there has been campaigns to bring children back to school. So I think it will really depend on context, what might be the best mechanism to reach those children, whether it's a door-to-door campaign or a national campaign or a combination of both. But I would say at the same time, to think about what is the capacity of our data system right now. Well, we don't know when children are going to re-enter and sort of what education they're going to get in the meantime, but how good is our data system now, and what do we know already about who is out of school and where they might be, and how in-depth information do we have? And that can be a starting point to tell us, well, it's only going to be more challenging from here on in. So I think just to start from where we are and what the capacity of our systems are, and then what might be possible when those children come back into school is important, because data systems vary in levels of granularity and timely data that they have. So important, I think, to think about that as well, to know where to target efforts to reach those children who might not be coming back into school.
Thank you, Sheena and Mark and Bilal and Mungyani. So I will
just
move. Go ahead.
Very briefly to as a follow-up on that, because in terms of the context, depending on how much of a health concern there still is at that time, thinking of the data, I think it'll be important not to look at it purely in terms of day one, who's coming back, and collecting that information then even in the official register sense, but have patience and sort of over a longer period of time to track the flow of students coming back, maybe with a delay, just to add to Sheena's point.
Great. We have a question on the YouTube channel from Professor Keith, and he asked a bunch of questions, but I'm going to ask Mark and Wangyani to respond to one of these, which is that out-of-school children is both a demand and supply side problem. So what data is needed for different age groups on the demand side and on the supply side to make sense of the changes in the number of out-of-school children? Yeah.
Okay, I can. Let me try and address this. So Keith Lewin is absolutely right. Out-of-school children out of school are children are out of school for both supply side and demand side issues, but also they're out of school for a number of other issues as well. And we usually talk about the enabling environment, which is sort of neither supply or demand. So on the supply side, obviously you need things like you need the right number of teachers in the right places, which you often don't have. You need the right school buildings. You need sort of toilets. You need textbooks, other learning materials. On the demand side, you need to address particularly the questions of cost, whether parents are going to send their kids to school. But also the question of quality. So, and a lot of parents make a decision about whether it is worth sending a kid to a school where they're not learning anything, or whether it is better just to send them out into the, help in the field or help in the house. So, and those are all demand side issues, and you've got to get them all right. You've got to get the demand side issues, you've got to get the supply side issues, but then on top of that, you've got to get the sort of enabling environment right. You've got to get the right policies in place. You've got to have the right amount of money and the right amount of money going to the right places. And you've got to have, the procedures to, so you've got to have data, obviously, so that, people like Sheena and Bilal can actually check up on the education systems to make sure that they are getting all kids into school and those kids are learning. And you've got to have all of this stuff in the right place. And it does, as Keith says, it does vary enormously. The demand and supply side issues vary enormously between different ages. That's my 2 cents worth.
If I could add just quickly, so as we're thinking of the out-of-school children initiative, moving forward, those are some of the questions that we are actually having to take into account as we reroute the methodology of how this initiative can better make a difference in for out-of-school children. So one of the things that we are increasingly getting to realize that we might have a lot of information and evidence on what's happening on the demand side, the barriers that are keeping children out of school, and what are when you have that, you also have the idea of the number of children that are actually affected. But then it's the whole question of how does this now translate into what needs to shift on the supply side? If we have this, what are the key policy issues that need to shift on the supply side? That's why increasingly we're saying we need to link what the data and evidence we are getting from out-of-school children studies with what's happening with overall education sector analysis processes, but also linking with other tools and resources that are being used by other partners like the World Bank Human Capacity Index, and related to information of looking at the whole context and seeing where the key critical gaps are. So we need to make that shift to saying we have the data of who are the children who are missing out and what are their critical and diverse needs and what needs to shift at the supply side. So you could use also questions of the whole question of costing that we're saying is a gap, using simulation, what needs to change if these children need to come into school. And I think Sheena did touch some areas that actually need to be looked into to link the two, but I just wanted to add that element to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think you have already mentioned the need to link the out-of-school children initiative with education sector analysis and education sector planning. But can you please elaborate a little bit on how that has happened in the past, or if you have any country examples where this has happened in practice, and any suggestions on how we can do this in the future, as this is, I think, important for a lot of our colleagues and also for the work that GPE does?
So I think there are some examples of areas where this has in a way tried to be linked. I think because when they are doing the sector analysis, I think one of the readily available data at country context has been, of course, the out-of-school children's country level studies. This has provided one of the evidences that has actually been used when they are doing sector analysis. But of course, this has been done from a broader perspective. What we want to do now is to really shift in and do dives in terms of linking those two areas and actually coming up with some concrete policy recommendations that actually can be used and effectively implemented to reduce this crisis. But at the same time, we are also looking at some examples beyond just using the out-of-school data to inform the sector analysis, but approaches and examples of country context where we have seen the effectiveness of doing that in terms of policy translation and actually reducing the number of out-of-school children. Translation where we can actually get evidence that this link actually resulted in the reduction of the number of children, and try to profile some of these approaches and examples for replication and scale up in other contexts. So these are some of the areas that we are looking at, and we're looking at getting some technical experts to support us with those kind of analysis and documentation of where we have had those effective links and approaches.
Thank you. So we have another question, and you're free to respond, but I would also like to hear Bilal's reactions on that, and if he has something to add. So there's a question that sustained reduction in out-of-school children depends on reductions in dropouts supported by actions in and around schools. Without this, out-of-school children will replicate for each cohort of school-age children. After at least 5 decades of dropout studies, what are the best predictive indicators for dropout that can define preemptive interventions? So if you have any thoughts on that.
I could take a stab at this one, and others can complement, but in the Monitoring Education Participation book, we looked a lot at the risks for a dropout and how schools can measure and identify those children. And we looked at, there's a lot of kind of contextual factors, like I mentioned, being overage for a grade or not having pre-primary experience, and all of these are kind of, they're possible risk factors, but they don't mean that a child is for sure at risk of dropping out. So what we talked about, and this comes from research out of the US and the USAID dropout prevention program, was the ABCs of dropout, which the A stands for, so you have academic achievement, so whether they are falling behind in grades. So that's a very clear and very measurable way that teachers or schools can tell if a child is falling behind. They can look at the grades. They all have that data. They all have that information. The second is behavior. So that looks at, is the child very, let's say, aggressive or acting out, or is that child very withdrawn? So that behavioral component is also something, at least when the child is in the classroom, something that the teacher and the schools can see and observe directly. And the third is on absenteeism. Sorry, so the C was academic achievement. So is on absenteeism. So the most direct way to see if a child is at risk of dropping out is if they stop attending school. So if they become more and more absent. And if they become sort of chronically absent, according to a national definition, and we provide guidance in monitoring education participation on how to create a comprehensive definition of what that is and how to create that to be sustainable across schools and across the national level. Teachers can measure that directly as well, and that those three taken together can help create an index of risk that you can then say, okay, these children who miss these many days, children who are noticeably passive or aggressive, children who are falling behind in these subjects, we're going to classify them as at risk, and then we're going to target specific support for those children, depending on the reasons why they're having those challenges. So this ABCs of dropout is something that we talk about, and I think something quite practical for the school level, but also can, of course, be monitored at higher levels.
Thank you, Sheena. I think Bilal has unmuted himself. So Bilal, I'll
yes,
wait for you to speak.
Sheena put that more eloquently than I could, but I just want to maybe add sort of two specific examples of the difficulty, where even if it looks like there would be a clear risk factor or a clear association or a red flag, such as teenage pregnancy or child labor, for example. It's difficult because when you go into the details in Latin America, for example, I know some of the research around teenage pregnancy and dropout, and a lot of the time the data is not good enough to actually disentangle any kind of causality or even the sequencing of events. And it's not necessarily, it's not clear even that dropout follows pregnancy or childbirth, or whether it's the other way around. But even if dropout was before the pregnancy, it could still be related in the sense that, well, if you're expecting to anyhow become a mother at 15, then why continue with your schooling? And it's the same with child labor. Are children missing a lot of class because they're working, or are they working because they're missing a lot of class and that's the alternative activity? So there are those difficulties around establishing causality, even with sort of what you would expect to be prime candidates for red flag. And so I would second what Sheena said, in the sense that we shouldn't be waiting for causal estimates there, but it's good enough to have a sense of what children at risk of dropout look like, in a sense, right? What characterizes that group, even if we're far from being able to predict sort of at the individual level that this person has X probability of dropping out, and just work with what we have, even if we're just talking about groups with an increased risk.
Thanks, Bilal. Thanks, Sheena. This is really, really helpful. And I think, just to keep mindful of the time, I will just, start wrapping up. And I want to thank all the presenters and the participants for joining and for, this enriching discussion and the question and answers that followed. There were a lot of questions that we could not get to due to limited time. So what we will do is that we'll circulate these questions that came from our audience to our presenters, and see if they can respond to some of those questions offline. And then all the material from this webinar, the presentations, the recording of the session, will be shared with you in a few days. So thank you for your patience in advance. And when we will share those materials, we will also share the question and answers, that were asked during the session. And then, hopefully we'll have responses from our presenters by then. And materials on school closures and policy responses due to the coronavirus pandemic will also be circulated, and they can also be found on GPE website in case you want to look at it. So thank you so much once again for joining, and we are really grateful for being able to host this very timely and meaningful discussion. And thank you to all our presenters once again, and all our participants who took out time to join us today. Thank you.